Welcome to HR Show and Tell. I'm your host, Chief Visionary Officer of Elevated HR. Today's guest is Carly Raddix, Senior Compensation Advisor at Gibson's Energy and the President of Calgary Total Rewards Network. In this episode, we chat all things compensation and why it's so taboo. We cover generous pay, transparency in pay, and how to spot if your compensation strategy might be in trouble. It all begins right now. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for another session of HR Show and Tell. I'm Michelle Berg and I am the Chief Visionary Officer over at Elevated HR. With me today is our guest, Carly Raddix. She is a Senior Compensation Advisor over at Gibson's Energy, but I think even more impressively, she is the President of the Calgary Total Rewards Network. That's right? I got that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got that right.
And overall compensation guru expert. And I am just so excited to have you here today and have this conversation today about compensation. It seems like one of the most taboo conversations that we can have. And I'm hoping that today we can just kind of open up the, maybe look under the hood, if you will, or unzip the zipper and see what's actually there. So Carly, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you were saying that you normally teach students. Is that right?
Yeah, normally when I do speaking opportunities like this, it's with post-secondary institutions. So it's really awesome to be in front of a different crowd today. As much as I love talking to the students, it is nice to also talk to the HR professionals.
Yeah, and actually, on top of HR professionals today, we actually also have some other business leaders within the organization, office managers, people who just really want to learn about compensation. And I was thinking that perhaps we don't start off with this today, but I think that somewhere deep down, people think that there might be like this magic formula to the most perfect compensation system. And yet, Carly, I'm going to throw it right out there. Does a perfect system exist?
It really doesn't. I wish there was a formula. There is a formula, but it's really tailored to each and every individual company. There's really no one size fits all.
No, fair enough. So just as a quick housekeeping, for those of you who have questions, you can use either the chat or the QA. Both work for us. And we'll try to ask the questions throughout my questions. If you want, we're going to leave some time at the end too. So if you want to wait till we get through the conversation. We started HR Show and Tell because I wanted to showcase the amazing professionals that live and work right here in Alberta, although admittedly, I've also done them with things outside of Alberta. But the idea was collaboration over competition. And realistically, I think that there are some of us in our area that do a disservice. We're sharing, it doesn't really happen. And so I've really wanted to give back to the community that has given us so much, and to really continue to elevate the profession. And I think that's probably a lot of what you're doing with Calgary Total Reward Network too, is trying to elevate the compensation. But let's back up just a little bit. How did you decide even to go into a career of compensation? Because truthfully, nobody grows up and say, yeah, I'm going to be in HR, but let me take that one step further. Yeah, I'm going to be a compensation analyst. So how did you stumble into it?
That's just it. I actually just stumbled into it. I know that feels like a typical HR answer. And I can probably speak for us all. And I think you kind of already said it, that we don't really say when we want to grow up, we want to be an HR professional. I actually had no idea what HR even was when I was a kid, although it was probably more or less referred to as the personnel department at the time. Oh, I hate that word. But there's actually a really funny video on YouTube done by HR.com where they actually have a video of kids saying that they want to grow up to work in HR. And it's actually a spoof. It's really funny. It kind of brings out the joys and pains of being in HR. So if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to just Google, when I grow up, I want to work in HR, and you get a good laugh from it. Really though, when I was a kid, I actually wanted to grow up to be a veterinarian. So it seems like a long way off from deciding to be in compensation, but I particularly actually wanted to be a livestock veterinarian. And, I grew up on a farm outside of Calgary, so becoming a livestock veterinarian seemed like a reasonable occupation to get into at the time. It wasn't until I reached high school that I had a negative experience with chemistry science, and I quickly realized my veterinarian dreams were going to be shattered. It was a very competitive program at the time. I imagine it still is. And there was also only a few universities in Canada at the time that offered that program. So my gentle soul wasn't up for that kind of competition. So I was kind of stuck after, for as long as I could remember, this is what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a vet. And instead I took a pause and I was like, you know what, I'm going to go to university and get my degree in business, because business is what makes the world go round. So I enrolled in Mount Royal University in their Bachelor of Business degree program. And I also decided at that time, I probably should get some office experience. So I started temping at some temp agencies. And oddly enough, that was when I was introduced to my first HR job. I actually landed my first job at Gibson Energy back when I was like a second-year student, and it was in their total rewards department. So I was on the benefits and pensions team, working there, doing, very administrative type work, being the student I was. And then Gibson liked me so much, they invited me to stay while I was doing my studies. And they're like, hey, you can plan your work day around school and we'll make it work. We love having you here. It was a really great opportunity. I don't think many students get stuff like that. So I stayed, and because I was a student, they kind of just flipped me to where they needed me at the time, because every kind of group in HR has their busy times of the year. So most of the time I was stuck doing, benefits and pensions with benefit re-enrollments, because we had a flexible benefit plan at the time and it required employees to enroll every year. And then I'd go into compensation. And I remember my first experience in compensation was with the compensation salary survey. And I feel like, that's kind of the gateway into compensation. And it's also like the initiation test, whether you're going to like work really well with comp or not. And I actually really liked it. I think it was just, I have this like keen sense for kind of being a bit nosy and seeing all this data come back at me and having to make sense of it and analyze. And I just really liked building a story out of what I was seeing and putting forth recommendations. So I think that's kind of where my love for compensation began, and it kind of stuck. So again, like I said, because I was that student moving back and forth, I was always like, please keep me in compensation. And eventually I got my time when I did graduate my degree program. They hired me on full time, and they're like, hey, we actually have room for a compensation analyst. So that was my first job, and kind of the rest is history since then. So I've spent a majority of my career in compensation and, dabbled in other areas of HR here and there.
Okay. So take us through, what does the day in the life of a compensation analyst look like?
Like I said before, I do a lot of speaking engagements for post-secondary institutions, and this is probably the question I get asked the most. And I'm really there, I want students to get engaged and realizing that there is a career in total rewards specifically, but compensation as well, because most of them don't actually really realize that it could be a career path for them. I often think students, grow up in a university thinking, I'm going to be a recruiter or an HR business partner. The more fun and sexy work, I would have to agree, I'd have to agree it is, but there is that component to comp too. So I'm always out there at universities talking to them, getting them interested, and they always ask me this question. So, I have to say there's probably no typical day. I'm sure most HR professionals can say that. But typically we would work in like cyclical chunks. So, I live my life one quarter at a time. Right now, many of us are in what we call survey season. If you know, you know. We are furiously completing compensation salary surveys. And, some of us are lucky enough to maybe do one big survey. But then there's some of us that, our companies like to participate in many, many surveys. So then you're stuck doing a bunch of them, and there's really no right or wrong way. It's just whatever kind of fits.
Is there a survey that kind of fits the most, or are there just so many surveys that you could what does the survey landscape look like? Which ones do you usually participate in, I guess might be a better question.
That's actually a good question. So I think it would be industry specific to probably who you participate in. You know, obviously throw out the big name out there, Mercer. They probably have one of the biggest compensation salary surveys, and it spans across many different industries. You know, Willis Towers Watson's another really big one. You have the Winford Group that's really good for the supply chain side of things. So again, it just really depends on the nature of the business and to what you want to get. But most of the larger organizations probably participate in Mercer.
Okay. And that's what we participate into for the majority of our clients as well. Is there, you know, what do you think it is though around surveys that keeps bringing people back to surveys? Because they're not inexpensive to participate in, right?
Oh, they definitely aren't. They're very expensive to participate in. And you know, there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes. So I can probably cough up some of the reason for the expense, but it gives you a really good inside look into market trends, market data. What are your peers doing? Because you can't really just go out and ask, you know, your peers like, oh, what do you pay for this job? It's kind of taboo in the comp world. So it just gives you that nice aggregate of information that you need in order to make an informed decision. So surveys, and you know, my heart goes out to those people that can't purchase a survey or whatever because they're always scrounging for market data, but yeah, it's definitely a really good way to get an inside look into what the market's doing.
Okay, so I kind of interrupted you there. So it's
okay.
It's survey season for you right now.
Yeah.
Outside of survey season, what does that look like in the role of a compensation analyst?
Yeah, so you know, once survey season tends to be over, and it's probably going to be over very shortly here, usually kind of wraps up around June, is there's that really small period of time that some of us are granted to do other project work. And those are the things that, you know, you can't get to during the year, or maybe something comes up in the year that you can now get to over the summer months. But as soon as fall hits, like September, that's when you're getting survey data back. And now kind of the fun part begins. It's probably my favorite part, which is where I kind of fell in love with compensation is, you know, you get that survey data back and you get to make sense of what you're seeing. You get to do all your analysis and research, and you can build recommendations to bring forward to senior leadership on, you know, maybe what their compensation planning program would look like, or any other kind of things that you're contemplating at the time, any other kind of programs that would involve compensation. You kind of have that information now, but it's all about, there's like, you know, like an art to it in making sense of that data. Cause, you know, I can look at the data, it's kind of like the matrix for me. Like I'm seeing all these numbers making sense, but I'm not going to give that to an executive. So I actually have to like dumb it down, make it like a nice one pager quick hit. So there's all this work behind the scenes that I do. And then at the end of the day, it's like, ends up being like a one-liner, but it's all worth it in the long run, all the work. So
do you see it changing much year over year, or especially let's talk the pandemic year? What's your predictions? Do you see some massive swings this year?
Yeah, and I can only speak right now to the energy industry. I can't speak to any others, but from what I've seen is I don't anticipate a whole lot of changes. There really hasn't been over the last few years. You know, base pay increases have been quite muted across the industry, as I imagine probably other industries as well. So it's not like, you know, when I first started out in HR, we had like base pay budgets of like 7%. Like that's like just unheard of these days. I think there's still, you know, some other areas or other industries like tech industry. I think they're still kind of after that kind of stuff, but just not in the energy industry anymore. It's a bit different. I think just looking for more of a sustainable approach these days. Yeah. How can we still provide value to the employees, but in a different sense? And I think that's where a lot of the intangible compensation factors come into play instead of just the tangible ones. As much as, you know, money at the end of the day is the best part, there's a bigger picture to it all. So I'd have to say I probably don't anticipate seeing a lot unless something picks up. But yeah, the pandemic really put a new spin on for everybody in the way we do work and the way we pay for work and everything. Because now that you have remote work, you even have people questioning now, like, do we still pay employees the same if they're just working from home in different locations, but doing the same job? So there's that kind of debate going on right now. And you'll hear some people say like, yeah, you should pay pay where they work, or no, you pay on the job. And again, it really just comes down to what the company wants to focus on there.
What would you advise? What's your thoughts? This is
Yeah.
not, I mean, I'll take your Gibson hat off. This is your Calgary Total Reward Network. What do you think should be what's the right step there?
You know, and I feel like I'm going to use that typical HR answer. It depends. For me, at the end of the day, it's all about what is the strategy of the company? What's their compensation philosophy? What do they want the right talent? Because if they do, they can definitely look geographically now. It's no longer just looking locally for talent, because you might not need people going into the office. Maybe you've developed a work from home policy. So now you can hire wherever you really want. I do think that there's still a component based on geographical pay, because some areas are just more expensive to live in, and the price for jobs there would be different. So I think there's still that aspect, but companies, it kind of, I guess it depends on what their philosophy is at the end of the day and how they want to go on that.
Yeah. I mean, when Salesforce announced, I thought it was really interesting. Salesforce is massive, CRM system basically for sales. And so they're based out of Chicago, and they were losing talent. I think this might have even been pre-pandemic, but maybe it was during the pandemic, but they were losing talent as always to like all over the place basically. And they made the decision that they were going to pay all salaries, didn't matter where you lived, all salaries was going to be based off of San Francisco.
Oh, interesting.
And San Francisco is one of the highest, right? Like that's where the salaries are kind of.
Yeah.
And what they said by that, though, is because they chose the most, expensive geographic location, they didn't care that if you decided to go hole up in Oklahoma, you just had to have access to really good internet. That was their only caveat for making that decision. And to me, that, like, I tend to go to what's the job worth, not where do you live,
Yeah.
And I think because at the end of the day, that's where my budgets should be set on, is what is this job worth? Now, on the flip side, you could potentially do it on the other side too. Doesn't matter where you live, as long as you're transparent about, but I'm going to pay, whatever, Calgary prices. So if you go move to Winnipeg, you can do that. But if you want to go move to Vancouver, I'm not paying Vancouver because I didn't ask you to go to Vancouver either.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I didn't see this as where it kind of goes to it. It's hard to say what's the right answer and what's the wrong answer, because even with that, like, we don't know what the future of work's going to look like right now, because we're still doing a bit of work from home. We're probably going to maybe go to the office. There could be this hybrid. So then again, it's like, if you're paying someone, say the San Francisco rate, but they're living in Oklahoma, say they quit, they're trying to find a job in Oklahoma, they can only find one that's at an office there. And suddenly, well, they're not going to be paying the San Francisco rate. They're going to be paying the Oklahoma rate. So now you have an individual that's not aligned to where they live. It's really fascinating stuff. And it could really go either way. And that's why I kind of bring it back to, what's the company's philosophy? What's their strategy around this? Because it's really what fits the company.
Because I guess my question there is, what does it matter? They've quit. So I don't care if they can't find another job in Oklahoma. That's on me. That's on them.
Oh, I know. I'm just throwing it in there, just saying that now the individual's like, oh, I was making all this money and now I can't unless I find it. You know what I mean? It's just...
To me, that's the risk. That's the risk that they take, though, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So they could always go back to San Francisco as well. If you're quitting us and you're making San Francisco rates in Oklahoma, I'm not going to be very sad for you.
Yeah.
Sitting a whole bunch of, anyways, that's we can move on from there.
Oh yeah, no, it's good. It really is. It's that nice mixture of, well, it is at the end of the day, what does the job pay for? Because I often find that with leaders, they always talk about the person when they're talking about me. I'm like, no, I don't want to talk about the person. I want to talk about the job, not the person, because the person you're feeling is a whole other character, and we can, pay based on their experience and their competencies, but what do we want to pay for the role? So it really does come back to that at the end of the day.
Well, I think that's where we're probably getting into the topic of job, like pay parity, and making sure that there is, this and I think that's the number one way to do it, is you do have to take the person out of it to really, and to make sure that you're paying the person what the job is worth. I mean, that's where I think a lot of the discriminative pay practices have come from, because we think about it as part of the person.
Yeah.
Where do you sit on that?
Yeah, no, gender pay, if we could probably sit here and talk about it all afternoon too. It's another one of those things that thankfully is starting to come up, and it's starting to become an important issue, and rightfully so. And a lot of compensation professionals are being challenged to adopt those, whether it's a formal policy at the company or whether it's just the practice that you're doing behind the scenes. And it's really, I can fix, whether it's a gender pay gap or even just a pay gap for the parity piece, I can fix that, no problem. I can give you a recommendation. We can do a whole internal equity piece, make sure everyone's paid. But how are we going to keep those people there going forward? Because you still have those unconscious biases that do happen amongst leaders. And that's where it brings in that collaborative HR approach, because I can't hold up the program all on my own. I do the best I can behind the scenes, and educating leaders and talking and challenging them. I think that's a real big piece for comp professionals, is don't be afraid to challenge leaders. You need to hold them accountable for their decisions. But then it's like, how do we at the end of the day keep it there? So it's working with, talent management. When you're hiring someone, are you looking at the rest of the organization, or whatever the process is? Maybe compensation's involved in that too. Just depends on the company. But are we hiring that person in and looking at the rest of the group internally and for the job? And like, there's just so many different components now suddenly you got to look at, but they're all really important pieces. And if we're not doing our job, then the whole thing's just going to crash again. So it's really like upholding and holding ourselves accountable too.
So how closely are you in your role? Like, because I know in many of the roles, and even at Elevated, I mean, we do comp and we do performance management, but how closely in your role are you linked to performance management or the people that are in, and does that play a consideration into your compensation strategy?
Oh, it definitely does. Internal equity alone is a really big piece. It's a part of our philosophy, and it's a part that we constantly educate our leaders on, especially during, annual compensation planning time, which we do hold every year, whether we have a budget or not. It's all about the educating and communicating to leaders and making sure that they're aligned with our philosophy. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones out there. They have to be preaching it, whether they agree with it or not. They still have to be champions of the program. And I often have to hold, like I said before, I have to hold them accountable. So there's lots of educating we do around that time. I do lots of stress testing on my side when I see things coming in during compensation planning, constantly running all sorts of data analysis to make sure that we're looking at the organization as a whole. Because sometimes leaders are just so focused on their little area that they forget that there's actually this bigger picture. So, we often hold a lot of calibration sessions with our senior leadership team at different levels, and it rolls up right to the president at the end of the day, and he does his own calibration session. And he has that overarching view of the organization and can, we've already stress tested and pushed a lot on our end. So when it comes up to him, he has a lot less to do, but at least he still has that lens to look at those things.
Okay. So what is it about compensation, though, that always seems to be so contentious? Like people are clearly intrigued by it. We had a massive sign up for this session again, almost right away. So what is it? Like, why are people so weirded out by compensation, whether it's compensation conversations or determining compensation? What's that about?
I often say people love to hate compensation. And sometimes I think it's got that because it's tied to money, which is, they say is the root to all problems. So there's this side that's, we have the tangible side, the money side, and then there's the intangible side too. But really at the end of the day, the majority of it's all about dollar signs. So because it's so deeply rooted in, behavioral, cognitive, like psychological and motivational development. And those are all the juicy psychological things that I'm not even going to begin to try to explain, but because money's tied to those, it has this whole new emotional feeling to it. And sometimes it's viewed really positively, negatively, and it's funny because I'm your like kind of quintessential comp nerd. And when I, express that I really like compensation to people, most of the time I'm met with like weird looks or like I have two heads. So I don't know if it's kind of tied into that too, like really you like to deal with that kind of stuff. But talking about compensation to employees can be difficult, whether it's good news you're sharing or even bad news. Things like whether it's a generous bonus they're giving or a well-deserved promotion, quantifying the performance and the value employees bring to a company can be so challenging to explain for leaders that, I'm often preaching to them that it's just really critical to have honest and open discussions. Like communication has to be the key in order to have a really good experience, I feel, with compensation. Most of us practicing compensation have learned the hard way that, if you don't have those strong communication skills, that you're going to struggle. And there's been times where, I've said the wrong thing and I've struggled through it too, or sometimes when I'm writing an employee communication or leader communication that I'll ask, HR business partners or someone else on the team just to read it, because sometimes I have that comp hat on and I'll use way too many comp type words and it just loses that kind of thoughtful, soft feeling that employees are going to want. And they're like, Carly, quit talking about comp ratios or, whatever that might be. Like soften your HR language there a bit. And it's really all in that communication. So I can get lost in that too. As much as, I like to preach it to leaders, I can sometimes do the same thing.
Well, I've always thought, I think why it's so difficult too is that it really is the intersection of personal worth and business worth. So when you say there's that emotional element there, it's hard to be logical when it comes to of my finances and my livelihood. And even though, there's that rational part of us that can go, yep, this is what compensation is, that makes sense, that's what the job is worth. Personally, I still always want to be making more. I mean, I don't think there's too many people that will say, no, please stop giving me more money. But because of that, it's so hard psychologically. I think it's so hard to have those fulsome conversations where people truly understand it. And again, there's so many problems with executive pay as well. We see it getting posted. We know, especially at publicly traded companies, we know exactly what the executives are getting paid. And so when you take that versus you get into this comparing factor, it's kind of like the social media effect, right? You always want,
that's actually a good way to look at it. It is definitely the social media effect. Starting back in this role, I remember my leader told me, like, Carly, just put on your blinders. Like, you have these like blinders you got to put on when you're looking at compensation, because you're going to see things that you're going to question or you're not going to agree with. And when you're new to it, it does, you have that emotional response that we're talking about. And you're like, God, if I only got paid that much, I could pay my mortgage off, or, things like that. And you're like, you just have to, like, I kind of have become numb to it over the years myself, but the, regular employee is not going to be like that. It takes time. And like you said, it's just, there's all these things at the end of the day, like, base pay is that fixed pay component. It's what provides us income certainty. So that piece is kind of the essential component to an employee's base or employee's compensation package. And often, sometimes that could be the only thing in their compensation package. So it's like, they're very passionate about what they're getting, what their worth is.
Sure. Let's talk about philosophies for a second. Do you think, or do you feel that compensation, and maybe I need to define compensation, but let's like real tangible money.
Okay.
Let's use that right now, is a motivator for employees?
So yes, I do think it's a motivator. It's all in how you tie it to the end game at the end of the day. I once read an article on Compensation Cafe, which is a really fun website that has these blog posts about compensation. And they actually described compensation as a three-legged stool. And I always like using this analogy because it really talks about that, the money piece, the total direct compensation, the base pay, the short-term incentives, long-term incentives. And base pay is, about getting people to come to work to do their job. And the short-term incentives are about motivating people to do those jobs better. And the long-term incentives are about people to care something bigger than their job. So again, it's kind of going back to that piece I talked about, the base pay being that, the fixed pay, the income certainty. And looking back at the three-legged stool, I'm motivated to work to receive my base pay because it puts a roof over my head, amongst other things. Maybe I've developed over the pandemic, I've developed bad Amazon buying habits or something that I need to keep up with. But there's that. And then on the flip side, though, it can also be a demotivator at times, especially when you're starting to look at those other incentives. If your company has short-term incentive program or a long-term incentive program, that's where you can lose people, because suddenly there's these other pressures to achieve these incentives because they're not as easy as coming to work to do my job. Now you're being asked to do a whole lot more and you're being incentivized to do something. So the expectation is to perform better, to get rewarded nicely. And, this is, again, I'm going to kind of keep tying it back to the communication piece, because to me, I think communication is so strong when it comes to compensation, is that leaders really, really need to have, those really clear performance discussions, if that's what you're tying your incentives to, is performance and goal related, and making sure your employees understand what the expectations are. Because sometimes you could, give an employee a goal, they think they achieved that goal, but at the end of the day, their incentive says otherwise. And then the employee is suddenly like, what happened? We had this discussion. I thought I met expectations, but the leader maybe wasn't communicating well with the employee, or vice versa, whatever. And suddenly now the employee's like, well, why do I even want to try anymore? Because I thought I did what I was asked to do and I didn't get rewarded that way. So for the most part, I think it's a motivator, but there can be those demotivating aspects to it.
Yeah. I see it certainly as short term, and then it does. You've nailed it, I think, too, is that the leader has so much to do with it. I think so many times bonuses and short-term incentives become the expectation. There's an entitlement thing that happens.
Oh, yeah.
And I think HR or comp analysts are often blamed for that. Well, it's not enough this year, or they were really disappointed. And I always have to end up turning it back to them and say, but how did, exactly like you said, the compensation piece, but how did you explain it? Where's your alignment? And that's where I think I see a lot of organizations kind of dropping the ball sometimes. They can have great talent like you, they can have a great resource like you, but you're not talking to the employees, you're not explaining it. It's on the leader side where they have to really understand it themselves. And if they don't be afraid to ask questions. Yeah, you just said comp ratio. I can't define what that is. That's not, right here at the top for me to remember. But I need to understand in what context would that information help me to have a better conversation with my team as well. And it is on me as a leader to try and understand it. And again, to even check in with you to say, okay, if I explain it like this, does that make sense? I think it's going to land for my team members. Thinking about that experience for the team member on the other side when they're hearing it, and crafting that message so that it lands in the way that you need to. You can't just go, here's your comp letter. Of course, that's motivating, but I have seen that. I see that.
I've seen it too.
all the time. So I feel like we missed a couple of questions here. So I am going to quickly just ask one to go back to the survey before, because we're going to go into another direction here. So I think this might be good to ask this one. How often are you updating market data during the pandemic times? Is it more frequent, less frequent?
Yeah, I'll have to, in terms of my job, it really depends on what the company's take on it is. Everyone kind of has their strategy around doing things. Obviously, I've taken definitely a look at any kind of, hot skills or things going on there, because suddenly there's jobs that have become way more important during the pandemic than they ever were before. My heart goes out to definitely HR people, because I did read an article saying that our HR people have been so burned out during the pandemic, because we've had to not only try and take care of ourselves and our families, but we also have to take care of our organization, because they're our family too, and we have to be there for the employees. So there's the HR piece, there's our IT department. They've been, if you suddenly have to work from home, where are we getting all these computers and setting people up and making sure they're connected to Wi-Fi? And there's so many different things. And it was interesting because I kind of felt like my role throughout this all, when the pandemic first started, we had a list of what happens if, you know, someone gets sick, then this group jumps in or whatever. And for me, I was like, I'd never not felt my job was less important than during the pandemic, because no one really needs like the comp person at the end of the day, you know, picking up phone calls from employees about benefits or questions they have. Suddenly my job didn't become as important, which was really different for me, because normally I'm very valued at the organization. I still am. It's just, it had this whole new look. So there is those, you know, those hot jobs, those hot skills. So definitely paying attention to those, because now that we're going to start hopefully moving into not normalcy, I would say, but just a different working environment, whether it goes back to the office or not, you could see a bunch of people exiting the organization, because suddenly maybe the organization's like, you know what, we just want employees back in the office. We're not going to do a work from home policy. And they're like starting to question, well, I actually really liked working from home. I'm going to go find another job somewhere else. So now you have all these people leaving. So you didn't have that during the pandemic, because everyone's like, I just want to keep my job. And some, you know, comp people had to keep track on, some companies were really hit hard financially. So what are we going to do? Are we going to mass lay off a bunch of employees, or are we going to try and keep the talent we need, because we're going to need them when we come out of the pandemic? What's our strategy there? And people are starting to get creative, and, you know, you start seeing different rollbacks of salaries or whatever that kind of looked like for the company. So comp people were still looking at what everyone else is doing, but at the same time, in terms of like we kind of talked about before with the market data in terms of salary increases, we didn't really have big budgets, let's say, for the energy industry. So it's like kind of all this weird stuff going on, but you're still having to be like agile and like empathetic, and there's just a whole lot of pieces going on.
Sure. No, and I think too, like I just saw an article this morning actually out of Forbes that was saying, you know, people being forced back into work in the States anyways, it's far more prevalent down there since they have their second vaccinations. That's another topic. But at the same time, they were saying something like 25% of people are just quitting on the spot if you're going to force them to come back to work. And I think you're right. Like people just needed to make sure that there was some sort of stability stuck through it. And now we're seeing trends are being told that you could expect up to 40% turnover this year. If you were between 15 to 20%, it's going to double, because nobody really left last year. They actually saw a decrease in turnover, chosen turnover, or like, obviously there were tons of layoffs, but that's not factored into it. Did you ever during the pandemic, did you start paying for internet, or have you heard, not maybe just at Gibson's, I don't necessarily, I'm not asking for details about that, but other organizations, especially in your role at the Calgary Total Rewards Network, did you hear of other organizations, you know, paying for internet now, paying for desks and things like that? And is that going to be factored later on into pay when you have to come back into the organization? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Definitely saw companies taking all sorts of different aspects of that, whether they gave employees an allowance, like a monthly allowance for, you know, internet access, or maybe they were doing it before. Some companies did something like that before. They gave employees like a lump sum to buy at-home equipment, because maybe they didn't have enough at the office. It was kind of all over the place to what companies could handle in terms of their own finances, because I think it becomes a bit hard at the end of the day when you have this like workforce that suddenly needs to work from home, but then you're like, my financials are being cut at the company, so now I got to cut people's salaries, but I also have to make sure that they're able to work from home, and it becomes a crazy mess. But I do think the best thing that a lot of companies did do was provide something to their employees to make that, at least so that they could do their job from home, if that was the case. And I definitely would agree that that was probably the right approach, because the last thing you need is someone on their home computer it's choppy, they don't have good internet connection, but the expectation is that they're in meetings and all sorts of things. So yeah, I kind of saw it all over the place is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's the question that we keep getting asked too, is okay, if we're going to move to the hybrid, because that's what people want, now it's a choice that they have, do we still need to pay for it? Like, and you know, my answer always is, well, you never had to pay for it beforehand. Again, in terms of from a company perspective, what do you think is right? Like what's the right, and here's the other side of that too, is real estate is actually, they're now, because of a hybrid model, they're able to contract. So there is a way that they can continue those, those payments. But again, it's so specific that I think so many people are looking for that one size fits all, the magic bullet for compensation, and it just doesn't exist.
It doesn't, because I would go back and say, I often get asked a lot, what are our peers doing? And they're always trying to be like competitive with what anyone else is doing. And that's definitely the energy industry is. We're all just, no one really leads. We're all just trying to figure out, what is everybody else doing? Are you doing that? Because I'm going to do the same then. Because I think it's like this idea that we don't want to like lose talent across the streets. You still want to maintain a little bit of, whatever it was that increases the employee value proposition. But there's really no magic formula to that one either. It really depends.
Well, actually, that's a great segue is that energy is always looking at everyone else. If any of you that are listening today have listened to the Adam Grant, first of all, Adam Grant is an organizational psychologist. He teaches over at the University of Pennsylvania. He has written several books. His latest one, I believe, is called Rethink. It's awesome. But in this case, he's got this great podcast. It's a TED Talk podcast that you can find over at TED Talk. And he did one on compensation. And not just your typical compensation. He looked at companies that are doing something unique. And two that I've been following for quite some time as well were the two that he talked about. So first was gravity payments. So you might remember back to 2017, I believe it was, where they raised everybody's pay to $70,000. Everybody. So it didn't matter if you were the receptionist or not. Everybody was making $70,000 and they hit the news. So at first I thought, oh my gosh, this is an amazing brand story, an employment brand story. It's great advertising, it's everything that an HR person crushes on. But I'll admit, I didn't think it was going to be sustainable. Here we are 4 years later and they are killing it. They're doing better than they've ever done. And then the same thing around this other company is down in Brazil, but they have employees all over the world. They talked about Semco, and Semco is a big proponent of transparency in pay, meaning they'll show you what everyone makes, they'll show you what the organization makes, and then you as the employee get to say, I'd like to make X. I think I'm worth X. And so two totally radical ways of attempting pay. But the first one, specifically as it relates to gravity, is really what is defined as generous pay. Like it's certainly, there is no market out there that says a receptionist or even a client service person, will say that 70,000 is on the map. But with generous pay, what it does is psychologically is these people now no longer have to worry, And so what they've said is that their productivity actually goes up exponentially because they're not worrying about all those little things. So I totally get that and I respect it. And it excites me to actually be able to continue to raise the bar. But what about generous pay at super senior levels? And because you get to see this, you're part of executive pay. Do you think generous pay does what it's supposed to at a senior level?
Yeah. It is interesting. I enjoyed that podcast, I have to say. I really enjoyed the Semco story. I thought it was very fascinating about employees getting to pick their pay. And the really neat thing was when they asked employees actually didn't really say like, oh, I'm worth $1 million. Like they were pretty reasonable about it, which was really fascinating. And then even with gravity, that wasn't the first time they've obviously made the news. I believe they made the news before for the unlimited vacation a long time ago, which caught a craze as well. So obviously two really interesting companies that are trying to be creative and enterprising in their space. But I do have to say, it's like, those are the tech companies that are just, always keeping things lively. And I often wondered what it would be like to work in HR there, which is a conversation for another day. But, I think his name's Dan Price, the one that he runs Gravity. And, it's kind of a stroke of genius in a way, but at the same time, you're like, kind of like what you were saying, like you're kind of skeptical about it at first, but it seems to be working for them, which is great. Yeah. And it's just, there's just so many components to it though. And in terms of, they're, I believe, a privately owned company where he owns a majority of the company. So easy enough for him to do as he kind of pleases, where I don't feel like something like that would be so straightforward at a public company. You would lose top talent, which is kind of going back to your question about senior level, people that are making above, let's say, that 70K, and then they're like, oh, well, this individual is making pretty close to what I'm making. You definitely lose that top talent, and I'm making assumptions here. And you also have to.
Well, wait, let's have that conversation. They said that would happen, and there were a few that did leave.
Yeah.
For the most part, their turnover has gone exponentially down. Because that didn't suggest that 70,000 was the only pay. It was that was their base pay.
Base pay, yeah. The kind of the threshold, really. And that might work at their company because, again, they're a small private firm, where as you have like a larger organization with many, many different jobs, many different generations, I could see probably talent being disrupted a bit by that concept. And especially, again, if you're you're a public company and you have to answer to shareholders as well, it could be demotivating on one side for people who've worked really hard to earn the salary that they're at. Like, could you imagine, a new grad coming in, they just graduated and they're making the same salary as you? Like you're suddenly both making 70,000 and you're like, I'm a seasoned professional. Where did things go wrong for me? So it could be demotivating in a way. And again, I'm just speaking hypothetically, but I'm not certain that it's a step towards a new trend. It's certainly like really interesting and creative. And it really just depends on, again, because he cut his own salary to make this work at the company. And yeah, and it really just depends on what CEOs would be willing to cut their salary to make it work, because they're smaller, it did work, and they're a startup too. And I find that startup companies, they always come up with these really creative ideas because they don't quite have, the capital yet to do other things like the short-term incentives and the long-term incentives. So that they get really creative on these other fronts. But the distribution for him was a lot easier because the money goes a lot further than, say, cutting a salary back at a larger company. It probably wouldn't distribute the same, but we actually have a thing in Canada called a living wage. It's kind of a similar concept where it's not the same as minimum wage, but it's what, companies feel that kind of, again, that threshold is that they're willing to pay employees. It's kind of a bit of a stress test so that employees can live comfortably and bring home what they need for their family. So it's a concept that is in Canada that has been starting. I don't know how much momentum it's got, but there are companies that have pledged, like, yep, we have a living wage and this is what it's set at. Maybe it's set at $10 higher than the minimum wage. And that works.
Yeah. But yeah, I do get those, specifically for those lower end jobs. If it doesn't have to be 70K, but if you can find a way to go above and beyond what
great.
And they are now no longer, because that was the story, is that he was talking to this woman who happened to have 3 other jobs to make a living, and they're in Seattle, Washington, so obviously cost of living is extremely high there as well. So from that perspective, now she has 1 job and she can concentrate, and so productivity then, so there was I think there was a throughput. And again, we're sitting here 4 years later and they are still successful and they have grown exponentially as well. I think there's that. Same with Semco though. So let's talk about, we're running out of time here, but we've got 11 minutes left on as it relates to transparency in pay. I'm a massive fan, just to put it out there, of transparency in pay. I have like if I could do even more, I would. There's, again, it's this emotional, logical, people hate it. People hate it that I'm, in a lot of ways, like we push it on our job ads. We want to get really clear what ranges are, etc. Again, that's from a pay parity perspective too. I think it's super important. I think it can also be used as a way to motivate people to apply, but also not waste your time with those that aren't interested in that pay. And people say, well, we can convince them that to come work for us. I'm like, no, if they're making a good wage, that. But anyways, again, emotionological. From the perspective then of transparency, like where do you sit? What do you think about transparency in pay, and what's your recommendations?
You know, I'm not against it either. And I'm not solely for it. I think there is a good balance to it. But again, and for me, it still comes home to that communication piece. If you can't communicate it properly, then it's going to fall flat and people are not going to be happy about it. But, you know, as a comp person, I do like a bit of transparency, or even more than what, you know, most companies are probably comfortable with. I think there's just this fear. Like, there shouldn't be a fear. If you do it right, there should be no problem, you know, and employees would be willing to accept it. But a lot of companies that are not fully transparent today, there's like that really hard jump to want to make it. And it's got to be like a very compelling reason. But I just still kind of like what you said, like if it's done right and you're out there and you're just communicating it appropriately and right, and it's got all the right feels to it, it ties back into what the company is, the culture, I think it's fine. It's just, I don't know, there's just this big fear around it. And it's really, I don't think it's that scary.
No, but I also say, you want to know if your comp like the first, cheapest, fastest way to figure out if your comp program is a good one or not, or is like, you know, fits and is part of your value set, is if it accidentally got left out in your lunchroom, would you be embarrassed?
Right? No, that's a good way to say it. It's definitely a good way, because yeah, if you're embarrassed, you're probably not going to want to talk about it transparently. Right. But there's also like, there's this trust factor, I think, too, is that sometimes I feel employers don't trust employees or leaders enough to talk about it or be transparent with it. There's just, I don't know, it goes back to this fear, but I'm like, if you trust your people, there shouldn't be a problem. And like, I like that analogy about leaving it out at the lunch table. That's I like that, because it's true. And if you are embarrassed, you wouldn't want to have it out there.
If you're not embarrassed, it typically means you've got a good process that you can stand behind. And it does come down to process. Compensation, I mean, my biggest, when we walk into organizations and we see, well, how did they make the same job, and how did you decide that they made this and they made that? Well, they asked for it. And that's like, you know, my heart sinks into my stomach at that point. Well, that's embarrassing. You know, but they've been here way longer. Or that's the other piece, right? Is that they'll have hired someone 6 years ago, but who they're looking for now to fill that role makes so much more, and they're not keeping up over here. Oh, no, we can't post that range because Joey's not making that.
Oh my gosh.
It's the comp program then, right?
Yeah, you just like, I feel embarrassed like listening to this story.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a couple more, 1 or 2 more questions here. Because again, it's not just my show, but sometimes, you know, that's the way it goes. What's your opinion regarding the changes we're seeing in education, moving into skilling and capabilities in different ways of learning? Do you see that this will impact compensation in the long term?
Yeah, you know, this is definitely an area that it's all about, that it's becoming skill-based pay. It's really interesting. Actually, at Gibson, we're starting to have this concept of talent on the move in the organization. Like, you know, does Carly, we have a position open, and it's not necessarily HR comp, but maybe Carly would actually fit that role really well. So it's this new thing that's becoming, and I think it is also becoming because, you know, work's been disrupted a bit with the pandemic and things have been shaken up a little. And suddenly you have, you know, a ton of people laid off that are like, I don't know what to do because there's really no work out there. And now they suddenly have to use their skills to do something else. I think we will start to see a bit of that skill-based pay, like want to pay for really good Excel skills. You know, comp people are known to live and work in Excel 24/7. Maybe I can use those skills somewhere else. And maybe that's a hot skill that the company needs that they're willing to pay a premium for me for. So
skills-based pay it's not the job, it's the actual skill that transfers over into the different job.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's lay this out. If there were 4 skills, for example, so Excel is one of them, that would be worth X dollars. If technical writing skills would be also part of the job, that's worth something there too. And then is it stacked? Is skill-based pay stacked, or how would you approach it?
Yeah, that's the thing, is it hasn't really hasn't really been developed yet. I think that's still kind of coming to fruition, but we are starting to see more of this. It's starting to become talked about. You're probably going to see models coming out about how to pay people for it. You know, even right now, there's a bit of it going on, especially if you look at like field jobs. Sometimes you pay a premium if someone holds a dual ticket in a journeyman, or you pay a premium because someone has a steam ticket, or you pay, you know, there's like different, right now we kind of already do it, but it'll be really interesting to see if it's like, oh, if someone has all these skills for this job, but you know, it could be worth X dollars, but I'd still see it being still a part of the role at the end of the day. You're still paying for the job. It's just moving talent around that has those skills, essentially.
Yeah.
It could morph into something. It's really fascinating, and it's going to be really interesting to see where this goes. But I do hear it being talked a lot.
But that's the thing here too. If our goal is to help organizations to become more transparent about pay so that pay becomes easier to talk about, for example, the ease of understanding pay has to be there too. And that's where it's like, how do we make sure that compensation fits all of those goals, essentially? And as soon as, because I think you can get really creative with pay, but as soon as you get creative, then you see all the executives start to nod off.
I know.
No, it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing either. And if they don't understand it, then it's going to be seen as unfair.
Yeah.
So it's that fine balance again that we're consistently going to have to play within the compensation. It
is. It is all a balance at the end of the day. That's why there's really no right formula. And again, if your executives are nodding off at this idea, it's probably they're not ready to adopt anything like that. And it's going to be a baby steps approach. We'll have that where we're like, we really think the organization would benefit from this and we really want to implement it, but you're just not getting executive buy-ins. You're like, how can I influence them to understand? So again, kind of goes back to what you're saying, like getting them to understand and educating them and the communication aspect. And yeah, it's a fun kind of dance that we play sometimes.
Okay, so before we close, I do want to do justice to, again, the Calgary Total Reward Network. Do you get together and have these conversations as well about compensation? Can anyone join? What does that look like?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. So CTRN, this is exactly what it's about is, you know, we're a local not-for-profit, volunteer-based association. We focus in all aspects of total reward. So it came about because a group of Calgary total rewards professionals formed the association because they realized that there was like a lack of access to that community for supporting their needs. So we created the association back. I think it was incorporated in 2012. So we're almost at the 10-year mark. And it provides this, it gives, you know, we have events, topical events that are mostly done by our sponsors that, you know, are experts in this space. And they talk about any kind of hot topics that are going on, anything our membership wants to hear. We also do have educational courses. If you want to become a certified compensation professional, we host courses through World at Work. We have over 170 members and we're growing. We are still Calgary Total Rewards, but we're starting to have members coming from all across Alberta. When we had in-person education sessions, we had people coming from BC. So we're starting to move into this Western Canada space. Memberships are super cheap. Annual membership $75. Student memberships $25. And we're going to be prorating that starting July. So in all of our events, we're starting to do a diversity, equity, and inclusion journey ourselves. And all of our events have closed captioning for people that are deaf and are hard of hearing, because we want to make sure it's accessible to everybody.
Nice. Okay. All right. Well, Carly, it is the end of our time today. I just want to thank you again for being as open as you were and answering my questions and really going through some challenging topics around compensation too, because I think, you know, it sounds like you have grown up in energy. That is where it is. And you are probably seeing all the other changes and things that are happening within the comp world. And it is hard. I think the main message that I took away is it's not one size fits all, but and certainly it's going to be organizationally dependent. Yeah. But if you can get past the business worth versus personal worth, having a good process like you have, being systematic around it, certainly would help any type of, to make a compensation structure stronger for organizations, doesn't matter, independent of size, but be consistent. That's what I heard.
Oh, no, that's a great wrap up. I'd say that's a perfect summary.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Carly. It was lovely to have you. And thanks everyone for joining us. We will be taking a break for the summer unless someone says, no, 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 we'd love to hear more. But I think we are going to be choosing to take a break for the summer. But you know, who knows? I might get bored. We might need to have another one. So right now we do not have a guest that's lined up, but we actually already have some guests lined up for September and October, which will be dripping shortly. So thanks again, everyone. Have yourselves a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.